The restaurant had exactly the kind of lighting that made everyone look slightly nervous, too bright to hide in, too dim to relax in, and Marisol Vance had been sitting across from her blind date for 11 minutes without him saying more than 9 words total. She had counted. She always counted things when she was uncomfortable, a habit left over from childhood, something her mind did to feel like it had control of a situation it didn't actually control at all. 9 words. She'd said considerably more than that, filling the silence the way she always filled silences, with questions about his work, his family, his weekend plans, and he'd answered each one with something clipped and polite, and entirely uninterested in continuing. Her friend Priya had set this up, insisting he was interesting, insisting she just needed to give him a chance, and Marisol had agreed because it was easier than explaining, again, that she was tired of blind dates arranged by well-meaning friends who thought her problem was pickiness rather than exhaustion. She was 28. She ran her own small event planning business, the kind that required constant talking, constant charm, constant filling of silence with warmth people could lean on, and when she went on a date, she wanted, badly, someone who could fill some of that space back. This man could not, or would not. He sat across from her with an untouched glass of wine and a stillness that felt less like shyness and more like absence, like he was present in body only, his attention somewhere else entirely, somewhere she couldn't follow. So, she said, trying again, because giving up after 11 minutes felt rude even to someone this obviously uninterested. What do you do for fun? Outside of work, I mean. He considered the question for a long moment, longer than the question warranted, the way you'd consider something with actual weight rather than small talk. I read, he said. Mostly. Read what? She asked. History, he said. Older texts, mostly. Things that aren't widely available anymore. That's interesting, she said, though she wasn't sure it was. Not the way he delivered it. Flat and closed, offering nothing further, no follow-up thread for her to pull. What period of history? Several, he said, which told her nothing at all. She looked at him properly then, taking in the details she'd been too polite to study directly before. He was undeniably handsome, in a way that felt almost inconvenient given how little personality seemed to be attached to it. Long dark hair pulled back loosely, pale skin that looked like it had never quite seen enough sun, striking gray eyes that held hers steadily without the warmth she associated with actual interest. He wore a dark, well-tailored jacket that looked expensive without trying to announce it, and he sat with a stillness that would have seemed impressive in another context, in a man who was actually engaging with her rather than simply enduring the dinner. I'm sorry, she said finally, setting down her fork. I don't think this is really working, is it? He looked at her, and for just a moment something flickered behind his eyes, something she couldn't quite name, before it settled back into the same careful blankness. What isn't working? He asked. This, she said, gesturing between them. The conversation. I've been trying for the last 20 minutes to find something you actually want to talk about, and I keep hitting a wall. I don't say this to be cruel, but you're. She paused, searching for a word that wouldn't feel too harsh, and failing to find one. You're very quiet. Too quiet, honestly, for a first date. I need someone who actually wants to talk to me, not someone who's just sitting across from me waiting for the evening to end. He was silent for a moment, and she thought, watching his face, that she'd genuinely surprised him, though whether by the honesty or the accusation itself she couldn't tell. You may be right, he said finally, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness she'd expected. I haven't been entirely present tonight. That's a fair observation. At least you're not arguing with me, she said, and there was something almost like relief in it, the relief of not having to manage someone's wounded ego on top of everything else. I don't generally argue with accurate observations, he said. She almost smiled at that, despite everything, some dry quality in his delivery that suggested there might be more underneath the stillness than she'd initially credited him with. But it wasn't enough to change her mind about the evening, about whatever this was supposed to become. "I think we should probably just call it a night," she said. "No hard feelings. I'm sure you're a wonderful person. This just isn't the right match." He nodded, unbothered, in a way that somehow felt neither wounded nor relieved, simply accepting. "As you wish," he said, and something about the phrase, old-fashioned in a way that didn't quite belong to a man his apparent age, stuck with her afterward in a way she couldn't fully explain. She paid for her half of the dinner, said a polite goodbye, and walked out into the cool evening air, feeling the particular exhaustion of a wasted evening, already composing the text she'd send Priya. Something gentle but firm about not setting her up again with anyone quite so silent. She didn't look back to see if he watched her leave. If she had, she might have noticed the way his stillness deepened once she was gone, the way his eyes tracked her retreating figure with something considerably more complicated than the blank politeness he'd shown across the table. She called Priya from the car, driving with one hand and the phone propped against the dashboard, the words spilling out before she'd even pulled onto the main road. "He said 9 words in 11 minutes, she said. I counted. 9 words, Priya, and 4 of them were history. Priya laughed on the other end, not unkindly, the laugh of someone who'd clearly expected this exact reaction. "He's not usually like that," she said. "My cousin says he's actually quite thoughtful once you get past the initial quiet. I don't have time to get past anything," Marisol said. "I have 3 events this month and a business to run. I need someone who shows up already interested, not someone I have to excavate personality out of over multiple dinners." "Fair enough," Priya said. "I'm sorry. I thought you two might actually suit each other in a weird way. You talk enough for both of you usually. I thought maybe someone quieter would be a nice change. There's quiet and there's absent," Marisol said. He was absent, completely somewhere else the entire dinner. She didn't think about him again that night, or told herself she didn't, focusing instead on the wedding she was coordinating for the following weekend, 120 guests, an outdoor ceremony that needed contingency plans for rain, a bride who kept changing her mind about centerpieces. This was the rhythm of her life. Constant motion, constant problem-solving, constant talking, and it left very little room for thinking about a silent stranger with striking gray eyes and an unreadable stillness that had, if she was honest with herself, unsettled her slightly more than she'd let on across the table. 3 weeks passed in the ordinary blur of her business, events booked and executed, clients managed, the small satisfactions of watching a carefully planned day unfold without disaster. She thought about the blind date exactly twice, both times briefly, both times dismissing the thought as quickly as it arrived, filing the whole evening under forgettable, a category she reserved for things that hadn't worked out and didn't need further examination. The call that changed things came from a client she'd been trying to land for over a year, a luxury hospitality group looking for someone to coordinate an enormous private gala, the kind of event that could genuinely transform her business if executed well. The venue, when she researched it, turned out to be a private estate outside the city, owned by a family whose name kept appearing in property records and old society columns, without ever quite attaching itself to a public face. A family with money old enough to have stopped needing to explain itself generations ago. She arrived for the initial walkthrough on a bright autumn afternoon, portfolio in hand, prepared for the usual dance of proving her competence to skeptical clients who'd built empires on being difficult to impress. The estate itself was extraordinary, old stone architecture softened by carefully maintained gardens, the kind of understated grandeur that didn't need to shout to be taken seriously. She was met at the door by a composed older woman with silver hair, who introduced herself simply as Mira and led her through wide hallways toward a study where, she was told, she'd be meeting with the family representative who'd be overseeing the gala's requirements. Marisol had prepared several versions of her opening pitch, tailored to different kinds of clients. The corporate type who wanted efficiency, the old money type who wanted discretion, the new money type who wanted spectacle. She was running through these versions in her head as Mira opened the study door, and she stepped inside, already composing her first line, and stopped completely when she saw who was standing at the window waiting for her. It was him. The blind date, long dark hair, pale striking features, the same unnerving stillness she remembered from across a dinner table 3 weeks earlier. Except now, he was dressed differently, more formally, with an ease of bearing that suggested this house, this room, this entire estate belonged to him in a way that had nothing to do with wealth alone. "You," she said, before she could stop herself, all her prepared opening lines evaporating instantly. He turned from the window, and something in his expression shifted, the careful blankness from their dinner replaced by something more alert, more present, an expression she hadn't seen from him at all during their date. "Miss Vance," he said, "I wasn't aware you were the event coordinator my staff had selected for this gala. I wasn't aware," she said, still recovering, that the too quiet man from my worst blind date in recent memory owned an estate like this. There was a pause, and she thought, for just a moment, that she saw something almost like amusement pass behind his eyes, quickly contained. "I go by Alaric here," he said. "Alaric Voss. I apologize for the confusion at dinner. I wasn't entirely myself that evening." "You mean you were pretending to be boring," she said, before she could stop herself, professional composure completely abandoned in the shock of the moment. He considered this with the same careful seriousness he seemed to bring to everything, weighing the accusation rather than dismissing it outright. "Something like that," he admitted. "It's easier, sometimes, to let people draw their own conclusions rather than correct them." "Easier for who?" she asked. "For me," he said simply, and there was an honesty in it that disarmed her slightly, cutting through the residual embarrassment of the moment. She stood there for a moment longer, trying to decide whether to be professional or honest, and settled, in the end, for something that tried to be both. "This is going to be an unusual working relationship," she said. "It doesn't have to be," he said. "I can be perfectly professional, if that's what you need from me. I understand if the history between us makes this uncomfortable. I can have Mira handle the coordination directly, if you'd prefer not to work with me personally." She considered this, weighing embarrassment against opportunity, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wasn't actually ready to hand this account off to someone else. Not when the potential for her business was this significant, and not, if she was fully honest with herself, when some small curious part of her wanted to understand what exactly had happened at that dinner table 3 weeks ago. "No," she said. "Let's do this properly. Professional. You give me the requirements, I give you a proposal, we build this event the way it should be built. I can separate the blind date from the business relationship. I do it all the time with difficult clients." "Am I a difficult client?" he asked. And there was again that flicker of something almost like humor beneath the flat delivery. "You're an unusual one," she said. "Let's leave it there for now." The walkthrough that followed was, despite everything, remarkably productive. Alaric knew exactly what he wanted from the event, precise details about guest flow, timing, the particular acoustics of the ballroom he wanted preserved rather than drowned out by amplified music, requirements that suggested someone who'd hosted many such events before and understood exactly what made them succeed or fail. He answered her questions directly, thoroughly, without any of the clipped disinterest from their dinner, and she found herself, despite her determination to remain purely professional, genuinely impressed by the clarity of his thinking. "You're very different here than you were at dinner," she said finally, unable to resist the observation any longer as they walked through the ballroom, autumn light falling brightly through tall arched windows. "I'm more myself here," he said. "This is my house, my responsibilities. It's easier to be present when the setting doesn't require me to perform an interest in small talk I don't actually have any capacity for. So you can talk, she said. You just choose not to, in certain settings. It's more complicated than choosing, he said, after a pause that suggested he was deciding how much to explain. There are things about how I spend my time, my attention, my energy, that make ordinary social settings considerably more difficult for me than they are for most people. I manage it as best I can. That evening, I managed it poorly. Why? She asked. What made that evening particularly difficult? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with obvious care. I'd had a difficult week prior to it, he said finally. Matters requiring more of my attention than I could spare for a first date with a stranger, however lovely she turned out to be. I should have canceled, rather than attend distracted. That was a failure of courtesy on my part, and I apologize for it now, properly, since we're apparently going to be working together. She found herself, despite everything, somewhat charmed by the formality of the apology, delivered with none of the false humility people usually performed when apologizing. Just a plain acknowledgement of a mistake. Apology accepted, she said. Though I reserve the right to bring it up occasionally if you're difficult during this event planning process. That seems fair, he said. And this time the almost smile actually reached the surface, brief but unmistakable, transforming his face in a way that made her understand, suddenly and with some alarm, why she'd found him handsome even during their worst dinner, and why that fact had bothered her considerably more than she'd let herself acknowledge at the time. The proposal she submitted 3 days later was, she knew, some of her best work, detailed and precise in exactly the ways she'd learned he valued during their walkthrough. His response came quickly, an email that approved every element without negotiation, followed by a note that felt slightly out of place in an otherwise businesslike message. I'd like to discuss the final details in person, it read. Dinner, if you're amenable. Strictly business, though I understand if you'd prefer to keep this entirely over email given our history. She stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Dinner is fine, she wrote back. Strictly business, and please, try to actually talk this time. His reply came within minutes. I intend to, he wrote. I find I have considerably more to say to you than I demonstrated the first time. The second dinner was nothing like the first. They met at a smaller restaurant this time, his choice, a quiet place with excellent lighting and none of the performative noise of the venue where they'd first met. And from the moment she sat down, she understood the difference immediately. He asked about her business, real questions, follow-up questions, the kind that showed he was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn to disengage. He told her when she asked about the estate, about a family legacy he described only vaguely as complicated, about his fondness for old books and older history, and this time the answers had texture, had warmth, had the kind of detail that made her lean forward rather than search for an exit strategy. I have to ask, she said, partway through the meal, setting down her wine glass. What exactly was different about that first dinner versus this one? Because I've spent a lot of dinners with difficult people, Alaric, and I've never seen someone shift this completely between two meetings. He considered the question with his usual care. The pause that she was beginning to understand wasn't distraction but genuine consideration, a habit of thinking before speaking that most people had abandoned somewhere in adulthood. That first evening, he said finally, I was recovering from something that had required a great deal of me. I wasn't lying when I said it was a difficult week. What I didn't say, because it felt like too much for a first date, was that the difficulty involved circumstances I couldn't easily explain to someone I'd just met. What kind of circumstances? She asked, curiosity overriding whatever caution might have suggested she not push. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the distinct sense of watching someone weigh a decision with real consequences. Not the small social calculations most people made, but something larger. Something that mattered considerably more than the dinner conversation would suggest. Family business, he said finally, the same vague phrase from before, though this time it felt less like evasion and more like a door being deliberately left ajar rather than fully opened. I manage responsibilities that most people wouldn't understand or believe, even if I explained them plainly. It's easier, most of the time, to let people assume I'm simply reserved, rather than try to explain the actual reasons for it. That sounds lonely, she said, before she could stop herself, the observation arriving with more genuine sympathy than she'd expected to feel for a man she'd rejected as boring only weeks earlier. Something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like surprise at being understood so directly. It has been, he admitted. For longer than I'd like to acknowledge. I've grown accustomed to it, the way you grow accustomed to anything given enough time, but accustomed isn't the same as comfortable. She thought about her own life, the constant motion of running a business built on filling other people's silences, and wondered, not for the first time, whether her own busyness was partly a way of avoiding a similar loneliness, dressed up as productivity rather than named directly. I understand more of that than you might expect, she said. I fill silence for a living. Literally, I plan events specifically designed to make sure no room ever feels empty or awkward. Sometimes I wonder if I do that because I actually can't stand silence myself, rather than because I'm naturally gifted at filling it. Maybe we balance each other then, he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, testing the observation rather than declaring it, watching to see how she'd receive the implication underneath it. Maybe, she agreed, matching his caution with her own, though she felt something warm settle in her chest at the suggestion, something she hadn't expected to feel this soon after writing him off so completely at their first meeting. The gala planning continued over the following weeks, meetings that gradually stopped feeling purely professional, dinners that extended longer than business required, conversations that revealed, slowly, a man considerably more thoughtful and complicated than the silent stranger she'd rejected. She learned he read extensively in languages she didn't recognize, that he kept unusual hours, often unavailable during daylight for meetings that had to be scheduled carefully around his preferences, that he moved through his own estate with an ease and authority that suggested decades, maybe longer, of complete command over every detail of it. She noticed things, small inconsistencies that she filed away without immediately confronting. The way he never seemed to eat much during their dinners despite ordering food. The particular coolness of his hand the one time she'd touched it accidentally reaching for the same menu. The way Mira and the rest of his household staff treated him with a deference that went beyond simple employment. Something closer to old loyalty. The kind built over considerably longer than any human employment relationship typically lasted. She raised it finally on an evening 3 weeks into the gala preparations, sitting in his study reviewing final floor plans, the room lit warmly by lamps rather than overhead light, the two of them alone after Mira had retired for the night. "Can I ask you something strange?" she said, setting down her tablet. "Always," he said. "Why do all your meetings happen in the evening?" she asked. "Why do you keep hours that seem almost deliberately built around avoiding daylight? Why does Mira treat you like she's known you for decades when she doesn't look old enough for that to be true? I've been trying to talk myself out of noticing these things for weeks, and I'm tired of pretending I haven't." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him make the same kind of decision she'd sensed him making at their second dinner, weighing something considerably larger than the question itself. "If I tell you the truth," he said finally, "I need you to understand that it will change how you see me, permanently, and I need to know you're prepared for that before I say anything further." "I think I've already started changing how I see you," she said. "I'd rather know the actual reason than keep guessing at increasingly strange explanations on my own." He nodded slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had a different quality to it, more careful, more deliberate, like someone choosing each word for its precise weight rather than its ease. "I'm not entirely human, Marisol," he said. "I haven't been for a very long time. The word you're probably already circling in your head, vampire, is accurate enough, though it carries considerably more complication than the stories usually suggest. She sat with that for a long moment, and found, to her own surprise, that the primary emotion moving through her wasn't fear, but a kind of retroactive clarity, pieces of the last few weeks rearranging themselves into a picture that finally made sense. "That explains the first dinner," she said finally. "It does," he said, watching her carefully, clearly braced for a reaction he hadn't yet received. That evening followed a night I'd spent managing a serious threat to my household, the kind of thing that requires considerable energy and leaves very little left over for performing normal human interest in small talk. I should have canceled. I didn't, because I'd wanted, more than I expected to actually meet you. And then I was too depleted to be present in the way the evening deserved. "You wanted to meet me," she repeated, "even before the dinner." "Priya's cousin had mentioned you," he said. "Described you in a way that made me curious despite myself, which isn't a common occurrence for me anymore. I don't often want things the way I found myself wanting to meet you." She looked at him. This man who ran an ancient household and carried responsibilities she was only beginning to understand the shape of, who'd sat across from her at dinner too, depleted from managing some unnamed threat to perform ordinary charm, and she felt something in her chest shift. Not fear, never quite fear, but a kind of vertigo. The sense of standing at the edge of something considerably larger than she'd been prepared for when she'd walked into this gala planning contract. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't a lot to process," she said finally. "But I've spent 3 weeks getting to know someone I find genuinely compelling, someone considerably more thoughtful than the silent stranger I rejected at dinner. I don't think one more piece of information changes that, even if it's a considerably bigger piece than I expected." Something in his posture eased, a tension she hadn't fully registered until it released. "Most people require considerably longer to arrive where you've just arrived," he said. "Most people haven't spent 3 weeks planning an event with you, learning exactly how thoughtful you actually are underneath the quiet," she said. "I think that gave me a head start most people wouldn't have." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being genuinely moved, the careful stillness deepening into something warmer. "There's more to explain," he said, "about what this means, practically, if you're interested in understanding it further. About the household, the responsibilities, the considerable complications that come with anyone who chooses to remain close to me. I'd like to understand all of it," she said. "Eventually tonight, I think I'd just like to sit here, with you, and let this settle before we tackle the rest of it." He nodded, and for a while they simply sat together in the warm lamplight of his study, the floor plans for the gala forgotten between them, the silence between them, for the first time since she'd met him, feeling entirely comfortable rather than something to be filled. The threat he'd mentioned, the one that had left him too depleted for their first dinner, resurfaced 2 weeks before the gala, in a way that finally gave her a fuller picture of exactly what she'd stepped into. She arrived for a routine planning meeting to find the estate unusually tense, staff moving with a careful watchfulness that hadn't been present during her earlier visits, Mira's usual composure edged with something that looked, uncharacteristically, like worry. "Is everything all right?" Marisol asked, finding Mira in the front hallway rather than the study where their meetings usually took place. Mira considered the question for a moment before answering, the careful weighing of information Marisol was beginning to recognize as characteristic of this household. "There's a situation," Mira said finally. "Nothing that concerns the gala planning directly. Older business. My lord is handling it, though it's requiring more of his attention than usual this week." "Should I come back another day?" Marisol asked. "He asked that you come in regardless," Mira said. "He said your visits have become, in his words, considerably more valuable to him than the interruption is costly." She found him in the study looking more strained than she'd seen him, a tightness around his eyes that suggested exhaustion of a kind she hadn't previously witnessed, though he straightened when she entered, some effort clearly going into presenting himself as more composed than he actually felt. "You look tired," she said, setting down her bag without preamble. "I am tired," he admitted, which surprised her slightly. This directness about his own limitations rather than the careful deflection she might have expected from anyone else in his position. "There's a rival family, older obligations, disputes that predate anything you'd find comprehensible in ordinary human terms, and they've chosen this particular month to become active again. It requires my attention at hours that leave little room for rest." "Is it dangerous?" she asked, the question arriving with more genuine worry than she'd expected to feel this early into understanding what he actually was. "It could become dangerous," he said honestly. "Not to you, directly, not if I manage it properly, which I intend to. But I won't pretend the possibility doesn't exist, especially as this becomes more widely known, that you and I are involved with each other." She sat with that for a moment, weighing the honesty of the warning against the fear it was clearly designed to test in her. "Are you trying to give me an exit?" she asked. "Because if you are, I'd rather you just say that directly, rather than delivering warnings and letting me draw my own conclusions about what you want me to do with them." He looked at her steadily, something in his expression settling into a decision. "No," he said. "I'm not trying to give you an exit. I'm trying to be honest about what staying means, because you deserve that honesty before you decide anything further, not after. Then tell me what staying means, practically," she said. "I've spent 3 weeks understanding you're thoughtful and complicated, and considerably more than the quiet stranger from that first dinner. I think I can handle understanding the practical complications, too." So he told her, over the following hour, about the old families that governed disputes like the one currently occupying his attention, about obligations that stretched back further than she could properly imagine, about the particular vulnerability that came with being visibly connected to someone in his position, a vulnerability that had, historically, occasionally been exploited by rivals looking for leverage. He didn't minimize any of it, didn't soften the danger to make it easier for her to accept. And she found, listening to him lay it all out with the same careful precision he brought to everything, that she trusted the honesty of it more than she would have trusted a version designed to reassure her. "I'm not leaving because a warning made me nervous," she said when he'd finished. "I came into this relationship slowly enough, and honestly enough, that I don't think fear is going to be the thing that ends it. If anything happens, if there's real danger, I'd rather know about it and face it with you than be protected from knowledge in a way that leaves me unprepared." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, the exhaustion still visible, but softened now by something that looked, unmistakably, like relief. "Most people," he said quietly, "would have already left by this point in the conversation." "I'm not most people," she said, "and I don't think you're most people either, whatever that stranger at the first dinner might have suggested." The rival family, when they finally made their move, chose the worst possible timing, 3 days before the gala she'd spent months planning, an event that had become considerably more significant to her than just another contract given everything that had grown alongside it. She received the call from Mira just after midnight, her voice tight in a way that immediately pulled Marisol fully awake despite the hour. "There's been an incursion," Mira said without preamble. "My lord is handling it, but he asked that you be informed, in case you noticed unusual activity around the estate over the next few days. He didn't want you arriving for a final walkthrough and encountering something unexplained. Is he all right?" Marisol asked, already pulling on clothes, some instinct pushing her toward the estate despite the late hour, and Mira's clear intention that this call was informational rather than a summons. "He will be," Mira said, though something in her tone suggested more uncertainty than the words themselves carried. "This is not a small matter, Miss Vance. I would understand if you preferred to stay away until it's resolved." "I'm coming," Marisol said, already moving toward her car. "Tell him I'm coming." She arrived at the estate to find it lit differently than she'd ever seen it. Fewer lamps glowing warmly through the windows, more shadows pooling in the gardens, a tension in the air that felt almost physical as she walked up the front steps. Mira met her at the door, expression carefully composed, but unable to fully hide her worry. "He's in the East Wing," Mira said. "I'll take you, though I need you to understand, whatever you see there may be difficult to process." The East Wing, when they reached it, showed clear signs of confrontation: overturned furniture, a shattered window someone had already begun boarding, and at the center of it, Alaric, standing with a stillness that had none of the gentle qualities she'd grown accustomed to. Something harder and older visible in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, in eyes that seemed, in this light, to hold considerably more darkness than she'd previously witnessed. "You shouldn't be here," he said, when he saw her, though there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely displeased by her presence despite the words. "I wanted to see you were all right," she said, refusing to be dismissed by the warning in his tone. "What happened?" "An attempt," he said, simply, unsuccessful, though not without cost. He gestured toward the damage around them, the broken window, a dark stain on the floor that she chose not to examine too closely. "They wanted to disrupt the gala, to demonstrate that my hold on this territory is weaker than it once was. They chose poorly." "Are they gone?" she asked. "For now," he said. "This won't be the end of it, not entirely, but the immediate threat has passed." He looked at her then, something in his expression softening despite the tension still visible in his posture. "You came here in the middle of the night, into a situation you didn't fully understand, because you were worried about me." "Of course I did," she said, as if the answer were obvious, which to her, in that moment, it entirely was. He crossed the space between them, and she noticed, for the first time, something different in the way he moved, faster than she'd seen before, a quality of controlled power that had been carefully hidden during their ordinary meetings, revealed now by circumstances that required it. His hands, when they found her face, were cool as always, but there was something more deliberate in the touch, something that felt like relief translated into physical contact. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she'd heard it. "I've spent centuries managing threats like this alone, and I've become accustomed to it, the way you become accustomed to anything given enough time. I hadn't expected, when I sat across from you at that first dinner too depleted to properly engage, that I'd find myself, weeks later, this relieved to see you walk into the aftermath of a confrontation, rather than run from the news of it." "I'm not running," she said. "I told you that already. I meant it." "I know," he said. "I'm still adjusting to believing it fully." She reached up and covered his hand with hers, feeling the coolness of his skin against her palm, the same steadiness that had first unsettled her at dinner, now settling into something she recognized as safety rather than strangeness. "Then, let me help you adjust," she said. "Starting now." The gala went ahead as planned 3 days later, despite the tension of the previous night, and Marisol found herself watching the event unfold across the estate's grand ballroom, prouder of this particular accomplishment than almost anything else she'd built in her career. The guest flow moved exactly as she'd designed, the acoustics preserved beautifully for the string quartet Alaric had insisted on, the lighting warm and welcoming despite everything that had happened in the East Wing just days before. She watched him move through the crowd, greeting guests with an ease and authority she hadn't seen at their first dinner. The stillness that had once seemed like absence now reading, in this context, as commanding presence. The quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to perform charm, because his authority was simply understood without announcement. Several guests, she noticed, treated him with a deference that went beyond ordinary social respect, the same quality she'd noticed in Mira, an old loyalty built from considerably more history than any of them let show on the surface. "You did beautiful work," he said, finding her near the edge of the dance floor during a rare quiet moment. "This is exactly what I hoped it would be. I had good material to work with," she said. "A beautiful venue. A host who actually knew what he wanted. That makes my job considerably easier." He looked at her for a long moment, something warm settling into his expression despite the residual tension she could still see beneath his composed exterior, evidence of the confrontation days earlier that hadn't fully faded. "I meant what I said," he added quietly, "about adjusting. I find I'm adjusting rather quickly, given how long I've spent without anyone to adjust toward." "That's good," she said, smiling, "because I'm not planning on going anywhere." The weeks following the gala settled into a new rhythm between them, dinners that no longer required the careful navigation of early uncertainty, evenings spent in his study, or walking through the estate's gardens as autumn deepened into winter, conversations that ranged from ordinary business concerns to the considerably larger questions surrounding what a future together might actually look like, given everything he was and everything she'd have to eventually decide about her own place in his very long life. She met more of his world gradually, careful introductions to old associates who studied her with a particular scrutiny of people testing whether she belonged in a world that had existed, largely unchanged, for centuries before her arrival. Mira, she learned, had served this household for over 100 years, not merely employed but bound by loyalty that predated modern employment entirely. A sharp-eyed advisor named Corvin tested her judgment with careful questions during a formal dinner, watching for the edges of her resolve the way old families tested everything before fully accepting it. "You handled Corvin well," Alaric told her afterward, walking her through the garden under a clear winter sky. "He doesn't warm easily to anyone." "I've handled difficult clients for years," she said. "He wasn't the most challenging test I've faced this month." He almost smiled at that, the small, genuine expression she'd come to treasure precisely because it emerged so rarely, reserved only for moments that actually moved him rather than performed for an audience. "You continue to surprise me," he said. "I don't think I fully appreciated when I sat across from you at that disastrous first dinner, exactly what I was too depleted to properly notice." "What would you have noticed?" she asked, curious despite the familiar territory of the question. "Someone entirely unafraid of silence, actually," he said after considering it seriously. "I assumed, at the time, that you filled silence because you couldn't tolerate it. I've since learned that's not quite accurate. You fill silence when it serves a purpose, professionally, socially, but you're remarkably comfortable with it otherwise, when the silence itself has become comfortable rather than awkward. That's rarer than you'd think." She thought about that, about the quiet evenings they'd spent together since the gala, evenings that no longer required constant conversation to feel complete, and understood, hearing him name it directly, exactly what had shifted in her over these past months. "I think you taught me that, actually," she said. "I spent years assuming silence needed managing. You showed me it sometimes just needs sitting with." "Then perhaps we've both learned something from each other," he said, and reached for her hand as they continued walking through the winter garden, the estate's old stone walls rising warmly around them in the fading afternoon light. Winter deepened around the estate, and with it came a different kind of test. Not the sudden violence of the rival family's incursion, but something slower, more insidious. The gradual realization on Marisol's part of exactly how much her life would need to reshape itself around the reality of loving someone who existed on a scale of time she couldn't fully match without a decision she wasn't yet prepared to make. She raised it one evening in his study, the fire burning low, a bottle of wine between them that only she was drinking. "I keep thinking about time," she said, watching the flames rather than looking at him directly, needing the distance to say this properly. Not in a way that frightens me exactly, but in a way that feels important to name out loud rather than let sit unexamined between us. He set down the book he'd been reading, giving her his full attention in the way she'd come to recognize as characteristic of him. The same quality that had first drawn her in once she'd understood the stillness wasn't absence, but focus. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "You'll still look exactly like this in 20 years. She said. "In 50. "I won't. I'll age, the way everyone I know ages, and at some point that difference is going to become impossible to ignore, for both of us, and I don't know yet what I want to do about that, or even what options actually exist." He was quiet for a long moment, and she recognized the particular weight of his silence now, understood it as careful consideration rather than avoidance. "There are options," he said finally. "I haven't raised them yet because I didn't want you to feel pressured into a decision before you were ready to even consider it seriously. But you're right that it's a conversation we'll need to have eventually, and I'd rather have it honestly now than let it become something unspoken and heavy between us." "What are the options?" she asked. "You could remain as you are," he said, "and grow old at the pace nature intended, and I would love you through all of it, exactly as fully as I love you now, for however long that turned out to be. Or, eventually, if you chose it, and only if you chose it entirely on your own terms, there's a transformation available, one that would allow you to remain beside me on something closer to my own timeline. It's not a small decision. It's not one I'd ever want you to make quickly, or out of fear of losing time together, or any reason other than genuinely wanting it for yourself." She sat with that, letting the weight of it settle properly rather than rushing toward a response. "I'm not ready to decide that yet," she said finally. "I don't think I need to be, not this early. But I wanted you to know I've been thinking about it, that it's not something I'm avoiding, even if I don't have an answer." "That's more than enough," he said. "I've had centuries to grow patient about things that matter. This is no exception." She looked at him, this man who'd once sat across from her, in near total silence, revealed now as someone capable of extraordinary patience and equally extraordinary care, and felt something in her chest settle more fully into certainty than it had at any point since that first disastrous dinner. "I love you," she said, plainly, the words no longer requiring the careful build-up they once might have needed. "I think I've loved you since that gala, watching you move through your own world with a confidence I'd completely missed the first time we met." "I love you too," he said, the words arriving with none of his usual careful deliberation, simply true, and immediate in a way that told her more about his sincerity than any lengthy explanation could have. "I have, I think, since considerably before you found out what I actually am. Since the first dinner, if I'm honest, despite how badly I managed it. You loved me while sitting there saying 9 words in 11 minutes, she said, unable to fully suppress her amusement at the memory, now that it had transformed from painful into something almost fond. I was managing an internal crisis while trying not to frighten away someone I already suspected I wanted considerably more from than a single dinner, he said. In retrospect, I understand why it read as boredom. I promise you it was the opposite. She laughed, genuinely, the sound filling the quiet study in a way that felt entirely comfortable now, no longer performed, but simply true. We're going to have to tell people that story eventually, she said. The version where the Vampire King was too busy fighting off an attack to make small talk on our first date. I suspect, he said. Some people will find that considerably more interesting than boring after all. Spring arrived at the estate with the particular gentleness that seemed to characterize every season there, gardens waking slowly rather than bursting suddenly, the whole property settling into new growth with an unhurried patience that matched its owner perfectly. Marisol had spent the winter months integrating her life more fully into his world, learning names and old customs, building friendships with people like Mira, and even eventually, the sharp-eyed Corvin, who'd warmed to her slowly but genuinely once he'd finished testing whatever edges he'd initially been looking for. Her own business continued to thrive. The gala's success, bringing in referrals she'd never anticipated. Wealthy clients who valued discretion above all else, finding their way to her through word of mouth in circles she hadn't previously had access to. She suspected, though she never confirmed it directly, that some of this new business arrived through channels connected to Alaric's world. Quiet recommendations passed among old families who valued someone who could be trusted with events requiring particular sensitivity. Priya, when Marisol finally told her the full truth about Alaric, several months into their relationship, took the news with considerably more equanimity than Marisol had expected. "I always thought there was something unusual about him," Priya admitted. Sitting across from her at their favorite coffee shop, one of the few ordinary rituals from Marisol's old life that had remained unchanged. "My cousin mentioned once that nobody in his social circle actually knew much about his background, despite him clearly being from money that went back generations. I just didn't expect the explanation to be quite this literal. Are you frightened for me?" Marisol asked. Priya considered the question seriously. "A little," she admitted. "Mostly I'm relieved. You've spent years running yourself ragged, managing everyone else's events, everyone else's celebrations, and I don't think I've ever seen you this settled, this genuinely happy, even before I knew the full explanation for it. If this is what makes you happy, I'm not going to argue with the details." "That's more understanding than I expected," Marisol said. "I've known you a long time," Priya said. "I know what unhappy looks like on you, and I know what this looks like too. And this looks like the second one. That's really all I need to know." The proposal, when it came, arrived on an ordinary evening rather than some elaborately staged occasion, which Marisol later decided suited both of them perfectly, given how their entire relationship had grown from unremarkable beginnings into something considerably larger than either of them had initially expected. They were in the garden, the same path they'd walked countless times since that first difficult winter conversation about time and its complications, and Alaric stopped walking suddenly, turning to face her with an expression she hadn't quite seen from him before, something that looked almost nervous despite the centuries of composure he usually carried so effortlessly. "I've been thinking about time again," he said, echoing the conversation that had once worried her so deeply, though his tone now carried none of that old uncertainty. "That sounds ominous, given our history with that particular topic," she said, though she said it lightly, trusting by now the direction their conversations generally moved. "Not ominous," he said. "I've simply realized I don't want to spend any more of it without you fully, formally, part of my life in every way available to us." He reached into his jacket, withdrawing a small box that he opened to reveal a ring, simple and old, the kind of design that belonged to no particular era because it had clearly existed across several of them. "Marisol," he said, "will you marry me? Not because time is running short, not because anything requires it, simply because I've spent months growing increasingly certain that I want to build whatever comes next specifically with you, for however long you choose to share it with me." She looked at the ring, then at him. This man who'd once sat across from a dinner table saying almost nothing, revealed now as someone capable of extraordinary depth and equally extraordinary vulnerability, and felt the answer arrive without any hesitation at all. "Yes," she said. "Completely yes, without any of the reservations I had about that first terrible dinner." He slid the ring onto her finger, his hand steady despite whatever nervousness had colored his voice moments before, and she thought, looking down at it, catching the fading evening light, about disastered dinners and hidden identities and the particular strangeness of finding exactly the right person by first almost rejecting him entirely for being too quiet. The wedding took place the following autumn, exactly a year after that first disastrous dinner, a fact Marisol found herself pointing out to nearly everyone who asked about the timeline, delighting in the particular irony of it. It was held in the same gardens where he'd proposed, small and intimate, rather than the grand spectacle she might have designed for a client, attended by people who actually mattered to both of them, rather than a guest list built purely for appearances. Priya stood beside her as she prepared, adjusting the simple ivory dress Marisol had chosen herself, nothing like the elaborate designs she often recommended to brides planning their own weddings. "You look happy," Priya said, studying her in the mirror. "Properly happy. Not event planner happy, where you're pleased everything is running on schedule. Actually happy." "I am," Marisol said, "genuinely, completely happy, in a way I don't think I fully understood was available to me before all of this started." "To think," Priya said, shaking her head with evident amusement, "this all started because I set you up with someone who couldn't manage 9 words over dinner. 9 words that turned out to be hiding considerably more than either of us expected," Marisol said, smiling at the memory that no longer stung the way it once had, transformed instead into the strange, fond origin story of everything that had followed. Her father, when she'd told him the news months earlier, had reacted with the particular mixture of confusion and acceptance that seemed to characterize how most people in her life had responded to learning the truth about Alaric. "He's very good to you," he'd said finally, after processing the more supernatural elements of the explanation. "That matters more to me than anything else about what he actually is. If he treats you well, and it's clear he does, I don't need to understand everything else about it." The ceremony itself was brief, simple vows exchanged in the golden autumn light. Nothing performed for an audience that needed convincing of anything, everyone present already understanding exactly what this union meant for both of them. When they were pronounced married, the small gathered crowd applauded warmly, and Alaric kissed her carefully, his hands cool against her face in the way she'd grown to find entirely comforting rather than strange, and she felt, standing there in the garden surrounded by people who'd witnessed the whole improbable journey from disastrous first date to this moment, a happiness so complete it settled into her chest like something built to last for whatever considerable span of years or centuries came next. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the garden had settled into its familiar quiet, she found him in the study where they'd had so many of their most important conversations, standing at the window in the thoughtful posture she'd come to recognize as reflective rather than distant. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, crossing the room to stand beside him. "That first dinner," he admitted. "How close I came to losing this entirely, simply because I couldn't manage to be present for a single evening at exactly the wrong time. I almost didn't give you a second chance," she said. "If Priya's cousin's introduction to that gala hadn't happened, if I hadn't needed an event coordinator badly enough to walk back into your life professionally, we might never have found our way back to each other. I like to think we would have, eventually," he said, "though I'm considerably grateful we didn't have to test that theory." He turned to look at her fully, something warm and settled in his expression that she'd grown to treasure precisely because of how rarely he'd shown it during those early, careful weeks of their acquaintance. "You saw past 9 words and a bad evening to something worth pursuing. That's rarer than you probably realize. I saw someone worth being curious about," she said. "The rest, I had to discover for myself, slowly, the way anything worth having usually needs to be discovered." He reached for her hand, and she felt the familiar coolness of his skin settle against hers, the same steadiness that had once seemed like absence now understood fully as depth. Patience. A quiet strength that had taken her considerably longer to recognize than it probably should have, given how completely it had, in the end, changed the entire direction of her life. "I love you," she said, the words easy now, worn smooth from months of repetition, though never losing any of their weight. "I love you," he said back, and outside the study window, the autumn garden settled into the deep quiet of full night, the old estate holding both of them now, together, in the particular permanence of a life deliberately chosen rather than simply endured. A year into their marriage, Marisol stood in the same garden watching the first hints of another autumn settle over the estate, and she thought about the version of herself who had once sat across from a silent stranger, counting his words with growing frustration, certain she'd found nothing worth pursuing in the encounter. That version of herself felt distant now. Not embarrassing exactly, because the rejection had been an entirely reasonable response to what she'd witnessed at the time. But distant in the way any early misunderstanding becomes distant once the fuller truth has had time to settle properly into place. Her business continued to flourish, and she'd begun, over the past year, gradually incorporating events specifically designed for Alaric's world, discrete gatherings that required an understanding of old customs and particular sensitivities that her ordinary clients never demanded. She found she enjoyed this work considerably more than she'd expected. The challenge of designing celebrations that honored centuries of tradition while still feeling genuinely alive, rather than merely preserved. Priya visited often, having become close friends with several people in Alaric's circle, despite her complete lack of any supernatural connection herself, a fact that continued to delight Marisol every time she watched her oldest friend hold her own comfortably among people who'd existed for considerably longer than anyone in Priya's own family tree could trace back. "You've built something remarkable here," Priya told her during one such visit, watching the autumn light fall warmly across the garden. Not just the marriage, the whole life around it. "We built it together," Marisol said, echoing something Alaric had told her once, a sentiment she'd come to understand more fully with each passing month. It wasn't really about the marriage specifically. It was about learning that quiet doesn't mean empty, and that the person who seems least interesting at first glance sometimes turns out to be the one worth the most patient attention. "You've gotten quite philosophical since marrying a centuries-old vampire," Priya said, laughing. "I've had considerably more time to think about these things, apparently," Marisol said, gesturing vaguely at the estate around them, at the whole improbable life she'd built here since that disastrous first dinner had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, turned into this. That evening, after Priya had gone and the estate had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Marisol found Alaric in the garden where he'd proposed, standing beneath the same trees now heavy with the first hints of autumn color, and she crossed to stand beside him without needing to ask what he was thinking about, understanding by now the particular quality of his silences well enough to simply share them rather than fill them. "Do you ever think about that first dinner?" she asked eventually, breaking the comfortable quiet between them. "Constantly," he admitted, "usually with considerable gratitude that you gave me a second chance despite every reasonable indication that you shouldn't have." "I almost didn't," she said. "If it weren't for that gala booking, if Priya's cousin hadn't happened to know you needed an event coordinator right when I needed a significant new client, I think that first dinner would have simply remained the worst blind date of my life, a story I told at parties for years, without ever learning what actually happened underneath it." "I like to believe fate had a hand in that timing," he said. "Though I recognize that's a somewhat convenient thing for someone in my position to believe, given how much easier it makes the whole story feel in retrospect. Maybe it was just luck," she said. "Or maybe some things are simply meant to find their way back around, however unlikely the odds looked at the start." He turned to look at her fully then, the autumn evening light catching something warm and settled in his expression. The same quality she'd first mistaken for absence, now understood completely as depth, as patience, as a quiet strength that had taken her longer to recognize than it probably should have, but that had, in the end, changed the entire direction of her life for the considerably better. "Whatever brought us back together," he said, "I intend to spend a very long time being grateful for it." "So do I," she said, and reached for his hand, feeling the familiar coolness of his skin settle against hers. The same steadiness that had once seemed strange now understood fully as home, as she stood beside him in the garden that had witnessed the whole improbable arc of their story, from 9 quiet words at a disastrous first dinner to this, a life deliberately chosen and genuinely, completely loved. She thought often, in the months that followed, about the strange mechanics of how their story had actually unfolded, the particular improbability of it all. A blind date arranged by a well-meaning friend. A man too exhausted from managing an ancient family dispute to perform even basic small talk. A rejection delivered honestly and without cruelty, because she genuinely believed she deserved someone who could show up fully present. And then, weeks later, a business opportunity that had nothing to do with romance at all. Simply the ordinary machinery of her career bringing her back into contact with someone she'd already decided wasn't worth pursuing further. She understood now, looking back, that the version of Alaric she'd rejected at that first dinner had been entirely real. Not a performance or a disguise designed to mislead her, but simply an incomplete picture. A man genuinely too depleted by circumstances he couldn't yet explain to show her the fuller version of himself that existed underneath the exhaustion. She'd been right to reject that evening on its own terms. She'd simply been fortunate enough to receive a second opportunity to encounter the rest of the truth. An opportunity that many people, she suspected, never received at all when a first impression failed to capture something worth pursuing further. Mira, who had watched the entire courtship unfold with the particular patience of someone who'd witnessed considerably more relationships form and dissolve over her long life than either Marisol or Alaric combined, offered her own assessment one afternoon while the two of them worked together in the estate's kitchen. A small ritual that had become comfortable between them over the past year. He almost didn't recover from that first dinner, Mira said, without looking up from the bread she was kneading. He was certain he'd ruined any chance with you entirely, certain his exhaustion that evening had cost him something he hadn't even realized yet how badly he wanted. I had no idea he felt that strongly, that early, Marisol said, genuinely surprised by the admission. He rarely shows what he feels most strongly, Mira said. You've probably noticed that by now. It took him considerably longer than it should have to learn how to let you see the parts of himself he usually keeps carefully contained. I think that's part of what makes what you've built together so remarkable. You learn to read him properly, past the surface, in a way most people never bother trying to do. Marisol thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, about the particular value of patience, of giving someone a second chance not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity about what more might exist beneath an unpromising first impression. She thought about her own tendency, before Alaric, to fill every silence reflexively, to measure connection by how much noise and energy a person brought into a room, and she understood now how much she'd needed someone who could teach her, patiently, and without judgment, that some of the most valuable things about a person only reveal themselves in the quiet, if you're willing to stay long enough to notice them. The estate settled into its familiar rhythms as the seasons turned again, autumn deepening toward winter, the gardens preparing for their season of quiet rest before another spring eventually arrived to wake them. Marisol stood at the window of the study one evening, watching the last light fade over the grounds, and felt, more completely than she'd ever expected to feel about anything, that she had found exactly where she belonged, not despite the strange beginning of their story, but because of every improbable piece of it. The wine that was never spilled this time, the 9 words that had once seemed like rejection, but turned out to be the quiet opening notes of something considerably larger, waiting patiently to be discovered by someone willing to look past the silence and see the whole of what it was actually protecting. That winter, on the 2nd anniversary of their first meeting, Alaric surprised her by recreating, with careful precision, the exact table setting from that disastrous original dinner, down to the same restaurant lighting he'd somehow convinced the venue to replicate for a single private evening. She arrived to find him already seated, and for one strange moment, memory and present collided so completely that she almost laughed aloud at the sheer improbability of it. "Are we doing this again?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from him with obvious amusement. "Once, properly," he said. "I owe you a better version of this particular evening, one where I actually show up the way I should have the first time. So talk to me," she said, echoing her own words from 2 years earlier, though this time delivered with warmth, rather than frustration. He smiled, the expression arriving easily now, none of the careful restraint from that first attempt. "I love watching you work," he said. "I love the way you notice details other people miss entirely. The exact angle of afternoon light through a window, the precise moment a room needs quiet rather than conversation. I love that you gave me a second chance I didn't deserve based on that first evening alone, and that you've spent every day since teaching me how to be more present than I'd forgotten how to be after centuries of managing everything on my own." She reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the familiar coolness settle against her palm. Understanding fully now everything that particular sensation represented, safety rather than strangeness, depth rather than absence, an entire life built patiently from what had once seemed, on its surface, like nothing worth pursuing at all. "9 words," she said softly, smiling at the memory that no longer stung, but had transformed instead into the fondest kind of beginning. "Look how far we've come from 9 words. An entire lifetime," he said, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "And I intend to spend every remaining moment of it making sure you never regret staying long enough to discover everything hiding beneath that terrible first silence." She laughed softly, the sound warm in the recreated dinner setting, and found herself thinking, not for the first time, about how strange and fortunate the entire arc of her life had turned out to be. A wasted evening that hadn't actually been wasted at all, simply misread in the moment. A rejection that had opened, eventually, into something considerably larger than either of them could have anticipated at the time. She thought about her father's simple assessment, that kindness mattered more than explanation, and understood now how completely that had proven true across every month of their life together. Outside the restaurant window, the winter evening settled into full darkness, streetlights glowing softly against the early snow, and Marisol looked across the table at the man who had once said almost nothing at all, and who now, 2 years later, gave her everything she hadn't known to ask for. She thought about second chances, about the particular value of patience, about how the quietest people sometimes carried the deepest wells of feeling, simply waiting for someone willing to stay long enough to notice. She reached for her glass, raised it slightly toward him, and smiled. "To 9 words," she said, "and to everything that came after them." "To everything that came after," he echoed, and they drank together, warm and certain, in the glow of a second chance neither of them had ever expected to receive, let alone build an entire lifetime upon. Later that night, walking back to the car through the softly falling snow, Marisol slipped her hand into his and thought about how differently this exact walk might have gone 2 years earlier, had she simply given up entirely after that first quiet, disappointing dinner. She thought about how close she'd come to never learning what waited beneath his careful silence, how easily an entire lifetime of happiness could have slipped past her, disguised as nothing more than an awkward, forgettable evening. "You're quiet again," he said, glancing down at her as they walked, though this time there was nothing but warmth in the observation, no accusation, no disappointment, simply an easy comment between two people who no longer needed constant conversation to feel entirely comfortable together. "I'm just thinking," she said, "about how lucky I am that you were worth a second look, even after such a terrible first one." He squeezed her hand gently, snow gathering softly in his dark hair as they walked beneath the streetlights. "I think," he said, "we were simply lucky enough to find each other twice, when most people only ever get one chance to notice what's actually standing in front of them." She smiled, leaning into him as they continued on through the quiet winter evening, certain now, more completely than she'd ever been certain of anything, that she had found exactly where she was always meant to end up. And so, on that quiet snow-covered street, 2 years after a disastrous first dinner had nearly convinced her otherwise, Marisol understood completely, finally, that the man she had once dismissed so quickly as too quiet had turned out, in the end, to be the loudest and most enduring truth of her entire life, patiently waiting the whole time, simply to be properly, fully heard.